In previous videos, we've discussed what servants to roll for. I've given you some suggestions for servants that you should look at leveling. I've taught you how to farm Embers, QP, and Ascension materials, as well as many other topics. Today we're going to put all of my lessons together and go for the big one, which is team building in Fate Grand Order. So for the purpose of this video, we're going to be discussing the things that I consider when I put together a team, as well as different variations on that. I'm going to be mentioning as many servants as I can to appeal to more long-time players, newer players, free-to-play players, etc. So hopefully you get something out of this. Thank you for watching, and here we go. So to begin, we're going to be discussing the first bit of information that you get in the game before you click on anything else. When you go into the quest, it will tell you the class that you're going to be fighting in that quest. Sometimes there will be multiple class icons to indicate that you're going to fight multiple classes of enemies. And those will be sorted in order of prominence, I believe, with the most troubling or most concerning class of enemies placed on the far left, and then going in descending order towards the right. Those will be located right about here in the screen when you load into a quest. And that bit of information is the most pivotal thing that we need to know going into any quest. I've mentioned this before, people keep not believing me and doing exactly the thing that I tell them not to, which is, it seems like everybody wants to build like one team in this game, but this game is not designed for that. This game is not really something that can be played with one team for all content. Generally speaking, you know, I know there are some scatty Dante people out there who are very upset with me after saying that, but largely my point stands. The reason this game gives you all of these team slots for free with no unlocking required is not so that you can build one team and never have to change. We're going to be changing our teams constantly from quest to quest, even potentially if we're fighting the same class of enemy. So these are the things that we need to be considering. First of all, like I've already said, is what are we fighting against in terms of the class of enemy that we're fighting. So based on that information and that information alone, we can start to put our plan together. Because if we're fighting, say, casters, we know that we're going to need at least one good rider who can counterclass and deal effective damage to those enemies, or to that enemy in the case of a boss fight. So I already mentioned the example of needing to fight some casters or a big caster boss. We'll stick with that example for the next little bit. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll come into our roster and we'll find that class, and here are basically our options for kind of the central servant of this team, the main character, the one who we're going to be building the rest of the team around. Now, once we have our options in front of us, I like to again stop and consider what is kind of the central goal or central concept that we want to be executing with this team. In other words, what kind of team is it? Is this a crit team? Is this a farming team? Is this a stall team? Etc. And any of those three things we can specialize towards Arts, Buster, and Quick, which are the three main card types. So is this going to be an Arts stall team? Is this going to be a Buster crit team? Is this going to be a Quick crit team? You know, we have all these different kinds of options. And to figure this out, we'd largely need to understand what we can do with our roster while keeping it in the realm of that counterclass set of servants that we just found for ourselves. So if we come back in here, we've got Achilles right towards the top, or at the top left specifically, who is a quick servant with an AoE Noble Phantasm. Next to him is Artoria Maid Altar, who is again a quick servant with a single target Noble Phantasm. We've got 2 single target Buster Servants in Ketz and Ozzy, and then Drake is an AoE Buster Servant. So if we're building a farming team, we might want to use Achilles and Drake. If we're fighting a boss, we might want to use Ozzy with a couple of Buster supports. If we're fighting, or if we are wanting to build a crit team, that's when we might specialize more in the 2 quick servants that we have. And I'm only using my 5-star servants as an example here, mostly because I'm a whale and I like to show off, but also just to keep things simple. Looking more at the free-to-play options, we can kind of draw a similar dichotomy, where we've got Rider of Resistance right here, who is a AoE Buster Servant, and then next to him is Alexander, who is a AoE Quick Servant. Ushi is single target quick. Boudica is Arts Support. And I'm typing all of these characters by their Noble Phantasms, of course. Medusa is AoE Quick. George is single target arts. Blackbeard is AoE Buster. So based on these kinds of things, we can come to kind of a determination in terms of sort of what team type we want to be building. And then within that team type, we can pick our specific option. So for the purpose of this video, we'll say we're going to be fighting a single tanky caster boss. In which case, I want to use a single target servant because they're more or better suited towards dealing high amounts of damage to one target. So we're going to pick a single target servant. And for the purpose of this video, we'll use my Rider Kentucky, who is a single target. You know what? I can do better with another servant, so we'll use Ozzy. I know he's not exactly free to play, especially mine, goodness gracious, but we'll use Ozzy for a couple of reasons that we'll come to see later in the video. So, other things that we need to consider, and the last point as well as this one, the larger point that I'm making here is that we need to have a lot of game knowledge from this point on. We need to know what, type of Noble Phantasm our servants have. You can find that out right here. Deal significant damage to a single enemy, use Buster type, as well as the other effects that are on this Noble Phantasm. We need to know the skill sets of a lot of our servants so that we can come to informed decisions about, like, for example, you might want to use Ozzy more than you want to use Maid Altar, because even though they're both single target servants, their decks are built differently, their skill sets do very different things, etc. So you might want to use one more than the other depending on what type of team you're building. And there are other things to consider with this as well in an even more meta sense, in terms of if I'm wanting to build a crit team with Ozymandias here, I don't necessarily need a star weight boosting craft essence, because riders have really high star weight already, and if he's the only rider in my team, any crit stars that we generate are already going to go to him, and I don't need to help him out with that, even though he doesn't even have a star weight boosting craft essence. Alternatively, if I am going to have another rider in the team and I still want to build a crit team, like if I'm going to have Achilles there to generate those crit stars for me, because he's quick-based and can do that pretty well, he's going to have a similar star weight to Ozzy, so they're now going to split those stars pretty evenly. Once again, Achilles does not have a crit star gather skill for himself, so if I wanted to use Achilles more as the main servant, or kind of the base servant, or the one that we're building the team around in this team, and I was using Ozzy more as the support for him, which would be weird, but just go with me for a second, I would need to give Achilles, like, Seal Designation Enforcer, or Talk on the Hot Sands, or something like that to boost his star weight so that he pulls those stars away from Ozzy. Another thing to consider, and we probably should have thought of this before we picked Ozzy, is, and this isn't something that you have to bring up for every fight necessarily, but we come back to what are we fighting in terms of the specific enemies that we're fighting and their specific, like, traits and mechanics. You know, is the enemy going to be divine, because there are servants who do extra damage to divine enemies? Is the servant going to be male or female, because there are servants who do extra damage to male and female enemies? Is the servant going to have any kinds of unique gimmicks or effects or skills that we need to be aware of? Like maybe they target divine enemies. There's a video on my channel, one of my gameplay videos, where I knew that an enemy that I was going to be fighting had a special effect or gimmick where they would target divine servants on your frontline first. And so I put in a couple of divine servants who weren't actually intended to do anything in the battle, but just tank the enemy for as long as possible while my real DPS did damage. You can go and find this video on my FGO gameplay playlist. Is the servant, or is the enemy that we're fighting going to be using their Noble Phantasm every turn, like some of the bosses towards the later singularities will do sometimes? Is the enemy going to be... there's a boss in the final singularity who uses a one-turn evade on himself, like, every turn, once he gets past a certain point in his HP, I think. And so you need to have some kind of way to deal with that, either in terms of the Servant's Kit, the Noble Phantasm, or the Craft Essence that you give to your DPS needs to be able to pierce invincibility and evade. So these are all things to consider in terms of specifically who are you going to be fighting, and then you can tailor certain parts of your team towards that target specifically. So once we've got those topics squared away and considered properly, the next thing, based on all that information, we will come to the determination of who the most optimal central servant of this team is going to be. Again, in our case, we've chosen Ozymandias. So then we come back to what do we want the rest of this team to be doing to support Ozymandias? Do we want to be using Noble Phantasms as often as possible? Do we want to be critting more often? Do we want to be... Ozymandias has a NP seal on his Noble Phantasm, so are we actually going to be stalling this enemy out and getting them to delay their Noble Phantasms by continually using Ozzy's NP to seal them? So these are things that we need to consider for our team. We're going to be building a Buster crit team, which is one of my preferred ways to play. So the main Buster support is, of course, going to be Merlin. His skills: Charge Noble Phantasm, attack buff, party-wide invincibility for 1 turn, Buster buff, crit damage buff, targetable to 1 servant. So he's going to be really good at helping us beef up those Buster cards and beefing up the crits that Ozzy's going to deal. Other good options: Hans Christian Andersen is a really good budget support caster. He has a really powerful targetable crit skill that he can use. Same thing with Waver, who's very common to find on support lists, as is Merlin. He's also got an attack buff. He's better at charging Noble Phantasm Gauge. His Noble Phantasm does a bunch of things that Merlin's doesn't do, so if you have a more stall-y kind of fight that you need to do, Waver might be the better choice. If you want bigger damage, Merlin might be the better choice. So these are things to consider based on what you're fighting and how you want to perform in that battle. Of course, I'd be remiss not to mention Shakespeare, who is a very easily acquired servant, extremely easy to level and raise his skills as well, who also has a powerful party-wide buster skill. His, like I just said, goes to the whole party, whereas Merlin's only goes to one servant. So if I was going to build a team more like this, for example, where I have 2 class-advantaged DPS servants, both of whom are buster-based, and if I want both of them to land big buster crits, Shakespeare might be the better choice than Merlin, because he can give a buster buff to both characters. And once again, the way that we parse out the differences and come to these conclusions is just by game knowledge, just by going into the servants and looking at their skills and figuring out what they do, and dedicating some thought to, okay, how would that work in relation to other characters and other skill sets that I'm familiar with. And you just have to put in that legwork for yourself to gain some of that knowledge. Okay, so once we've got our main support servant squared away, and these are always a big deal, the amount of benefit that you get from having one of these main support servants in your team, like a dedicated support unit who can just focus on buffing and support in this game, is really quite noticeable. I would recommend that if you're going into any kind of challenging content that calls for more than just throw some class advantage units at this node and you'll win, anything above that difficulty level, I pretty much always recommend going along with, Merlin, Scatty, Tamamo, Artoria, Caster when she comes out, so on and so forth. Having that dedicated support unit to boost the performance of one of your other characters or the rest of the team is just a huge boon to you. But once we've got that slot figured out and squared away, we have a third slot that we need to come up with. This one's pretty flexible in most teams. You can do different things, as always, depending on how you want to perform and how you think this specific fight is going to go down. What is it calling for? If I need to use, more DPS, I could put Artoria, Santa back in, just like we had a minute ago. Or maybe I'm concerned about if this boss isn't fighting alone, if I have a caster boss and they've got a couple of mobs helping them out, and so it's going to be like a 3-on-3 situation, and I want to use an AoE servant to clear out the mobs so that I can just focus on the boss. So maybe I want like a class-advantaged AoE servant. Or a servant like Ishtar Rider, who can deal some damage on her own, but also has some skills in which she can support the team, where she can give out a little bit of extra buster damage to Ozzy, as well as dealing some of her own damage. This is often called an off support as a role. There are a handful of servants throughout the game, a couple in every class, that kind of fill that position, where they can support a little bit and they can do a little bit of their own damage as well. Somebody like this character is a good example, where she can decrease defense and increase all allies' attack and quick card effectiveness, as well as buffing herself with the standard Imperial Privilege benefits. and then she has a single target quick Noble Phantasm, so it hits really hard. So this is a kind of like off support unit who isn't strictly a dedicated support character like Merlin. She can still hold her own a little bit, not quite to the degree that somebody like Ozzy can, who is fully focused on... Ozzy's not actually fully focused on damage, but you get what I'm saying. They can do a little bit of support, they can do a little bit of DPS. Maybe we are concerned about the enemy maybe has a ton of HP, like the Saber Altar Memorial fight that we get sometimes, where she's got like 2 million total HP divided across 3 break bars, in which case we might want to focus more on defensive utility for this last slot, rather than adding additional damage. So we could add somebody like Mash, or Jeanne d'Arc, who is going to heal and buff defense, and put up invincibility to defend against Noble Phantasms when Merlin's skill is down. And maybe with that more defensive servant, we're really concerned about getting them to use their Noble Phantasm as often as possible to keep their defenses up, or their invincibility buffs up, or whatever, as often as possible. So, and we're willing to give up some of our crit ability in order to accomplish that. So we might give them a craft essence like this. And just kind of as a quick aside, if you don't know what kind of craft essence you want to use, or you're not familiar with every craft essence yet, you can come into the craft essence menu right here, and then you can go to filter and scroll down, and it has the list of every effect that is on a craft essence. So if we're like, I don't know, I want to use one that's going to buff NP strength, we can click that one on, and then it'll sort and only show me craft essences that have that effect. Maybe you're somebody who likes to use Hijikata, and you want a craft essence with guts, so you can sort by only craft essences that have guts. Maybe you're... etc. So you can use this to filter out the effects that you're not interested in, and only show you the craft essences that are relevant to whatever kind of team you're building. So that's how you can find stuff quickly if you're not familiar with the effect of every craft essence, or you don't have a specific one in mind just yet. More likely in, as we defined at the beginning of this video, in a Buster crit team like the one that we're building here, you have somebody like this, because if we've got Ozzy's bringing the Buster cards and Merlin's bringing the damage buffs, the third thing that we need in a Buster crit team is the ability to crit. Ozzy and Merlin aren't going to be generating all that many stars on their own, so we need somebody else who can supply that ingredient. So we would have like an assassin, but there's a little bit of an issue, isn't there? Because if we're fighting a caster, that caster's gonna destroy our assassins. So there's a couple things that we can do. We can bring a really tanky assassin, like Cursed Arm here, who has his protection from arrows skill that makes him able to take a lot of punishment before he goes down. Or we could bring another support unit, like Hans, who we already mentioned, who can actually generate stars passively with his skill. And if this was at level 10, which is a 2-star, it wouldn't be hard for me to get this skill to level 10. He'll actually do that for 3 out of every 5 turns, because his cooldown would go down by 1 more at level 10, as all skills do. So he would be passively generating stars on 3 out of every 5 turns. And then, if we wanted to enhance that even further, we could use a craft essence like this that also passively generates stars every turn. And since I'm a filthy whale, I have 2 of these max limit broken, so I could give 1 to Merlin and 1 to Hans, and that's 20 stars passively every turn. Ozzy will absorb them because, as we discussed earlier, he's a rider with naturally really high star weight. Merlin will buff his Buster cards, Hans will buff his crit damage, Ozzy will buff his own attack stat, and then we'll just wreck whatever we hit. And we could further emphasize Ozzy's crit damage with a craft essence like this one that improves his critical strength. I wouldn't recommend this one specifically in this team because his crit star gather rate is already going to be good enough with no other archers or riders competing for those stars. They're all going to go to him anyways. So instead, maybe we'd use a craft essence like this one that buffs Buster card damage and crit damage. He's going to be doing Buster crits specifically. This improves both of those things. So maybe this would be kind of the ideal craft essence. So now we've got this team that is going to be producing between 20 and 30 crit stars every single turn before I even use any cards. Hans Christian Andersen is there to buff crit damage and help provide those stars. Merlin is there to buff attack and Buster card damage and crit damage, as well as he's going to provide, both him and Hans actually going to provide a little bit of sustain to the team with their Noble Phantasms. Ozzy is going to absorb those stars naturally without any help from anything, just because of the class stats that are associated with him. He's going to buff himself with, he has 2 skills that buff himself actually. And then his craft essence is further boosting the damage of both his Buster cards and his crits, which are all going to compound with those same buffs that we have coming from the other 2. This is what I would call a pretty good team. The one thing to keep in mind in a team like this, and really in any multi-class team, is that the boss we set as a caster, so they're going to be dealing neutral damage to Merlin and to Hans. That presents a little bit of a challenge. That means that they will probably die first, or sooner than Ozzy at the very least. And that's what our last 2 and 3 slots are for. I understand that not everybody has every character, so for you, probably, not probably necessarily, but, you know, possibly you might have 3 open slots left. I've got 2 open slots in a support slot. So it maybe is a little bit different for you. But so when we come to our last couple slots, the things that we want to consider, first off is who's most irreplaceable in this team. For us, that's going to be Ozzy. Right? Like if Ozzy goes down, this team has 0 damage. So the things to do there are either to make sure that Ozzy doesn't die, or we could try to put in somebody who can kind of fill that role for him in case he does. Somebody like a Ketz, who is also a single target Buster servant, who also has Ozzy's benefit of being a rider and therefore having class advantage, but also having really high star weight to take advantage of all the free passive crit stars that the other party is generating. So we can hedge, so to speak, with putting in somebody else who is going to be able to take up that same job, just on the off chance that Ozzy goes down. Or we can just do our best in the normal gameplay to make sure that Ozzy doesn't go down. Choice is up to you. Other thing to consider is going to be, right, what if one of our 2 crit supports dies? And in that case, we could have a secondary DPS come in, and we would lose a lot of the crit utility at that point, but we would have another DPS to hopefully pick up the slack anyways. Other thing that we could do is we could put in another crit support type servant who can just, you know, take up the role if Merlin or Hans go down. Somebody like a Waver who has that crit damage buff skill, and I would probably try to find another crit star generating craft essence to give to him in a case like that, so that it won't be as good as my max limit broken 2030s, but it'll still be some of that. It'll still be some extra crit star income. Final thing to consider with these last couple servants is the order that we're going to put them in, because they're going to feed into the team based on whoever's in the leftmost slot. So in this team, if Hans dies, it'll be Ketz who comes in, whereas in this team, if Hans dies, it'll be Waver who comes in. So the thing to consider is who is most likely in our initial team to die first. And it's pretty obvious in our case that if somebody's going to die here, it's going to be Hans, because he's got a lower health stat than anybody else in the team by far. And since we're, again, fighting a caster, he's going to be taking neutral, normal damage from that enemy. So a hit towards him is going to be way more dire than a hit towards Ozzy, because he'll reduce it by half for having class advantage, and it's going to be more dire than Merlin, because Merlin at least has a much chunkier health stat that he can take those hits better, whereas Hans has comparatively way less HP. So we would now consider, okay, if we know that Hans is probably going to die first, how are we going to position our backline members to replace him in what order, you know, if he does go down? So do we want that secondary DPS to come in next, or do we want that additional crit support to come in? Whereas if our team was, if we were fighting some other kind of enemy and like Ozzy was most likely to die, we would probably want Ketz to come in first and replace him, because if Waver comes in first, and now we just have 3 support casters who are, you know, dealing 1,000 damage per turn, that puts us in a pretty bad spot. So we just want to consider who's going to die first so that they can be replaced in the way that we want them to. So yeah, this video has gone on for a very long time now. My apologies if that's inconvenient for you, but I hope that you took something from this. This is how I go about building my teams. As you get better at this, it doesn't require so much consideration and deliberation and that kind of thing. You'll just get naturally better at identifying, like, okay, I want to build a crit team. These are my units who are kind of crit compatible with class advantage. You know, if you are running a Lancer team and you just know eventually that Cuchulainn Prototype has a crit gather skill, so you probably want to be using him. These are things that are just going to come with you knowing more about the game and knowing more about your servants and what they can offer and what they can do in their skills and their noble phantasms, as well as knowing about class stuff. Like I said, you know, every class has different star weights. Berserkers have almost none. So you can build them into crit servants if you really break your back to do so, but probably you're better off building a different kind of team around a Berserker if that's who you want to build the team around. If you're going to be using an Archer as your main servant, it's good to know that Emiya has a skill by which he can increase his crit damage by 100%. So you can double the damage of his own crits before you bring in Waver's crit damage buff, or Hans's crit damage buff, or Merlin's crit damage buff. But you also want to know in that circumstance that Emiya has a really weird skill, or a really weird card deck, that is mostly arts cards, so maybe Merlin's not the best choice for that. Maybe for Emiya you would want more like this team and just focus on that crit damage buffing, and let Emiya be, you know, in an arts team where he can get a arts chain more often and get up to that noble phantasm, and then he'll crit on most of his cards in the same kind of way that this team will. So these are the kinds of things that I consider when I'm putting my teams together. As you gain more knowledge about the game, learn more about class stats and these kinds of things, and what your servants can do with their kits, you'll be able to put these together much quicker, much more efficiently than what I've demonstrated here, which is trying to drag the process out as in-depth as possible. That said, if you do have any questions about anything that I said in this video, please do let me know in the comment section below. You can also contact me on Discord if you'd rather talk there. I'm going to have my Discord username in the description. as well as my in-game follow code, which will let you use my support list during Part 1 story quests. My current support list is on display right now. You can, if these look like some fun servants to use, you can use my follow code. Please do get in contact with me if you need to, and I always love to see video recommendations or things that you're struggling with in the game, things that I can help clear up for you. If you're having that issue, somebody else is having that issue, so let me know, and then I can make the video and help you and other people who are also struggling. So do get in contact with me with anything that you need. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something. I will see you next time.